The Quran is a sacred text that has been the subject of interpretation and analysis for centuries. While classical methods of Quranic exegesis have relied heavily on linguistic conventions and presupposed meanings, the advent of modern symbolic logic offers a new and powerful framework for deriving meaning from the Quran's words. By applying the principles and rules of symbolic logic, which are grounded in the precise language of mathematics, we can analyze Quranic terms in a more systematic and rigorous way, uncovering new insights and connections that traditional methods may overlook. This essay will explore how symbolic logic can be used as a tool for Quranic interpretation, focusing on the application of key logical rules such as non-contradiction, excluded middle, identity, and sufficient reason.
What you think you will never learn in your career as a philosopher.
The development of symbolic logic marked a significant shift in the way we analyze and interpret language. By representing propositions using clear, unambiguous mathematical notations, symbolic logic allows us to study their structure and relationship with a new level of precision and rigor. This has led to groundbreaking advances in fields like mathematics, philosophy, and computer science. As we will see, applying symbolic logic to the Quran can similarly yield new and valuable insights into the meaning of its words. What we see in classical logic is merely the outline, the silhouette of that science, and it's what some of us, as I surely did, thought most of logic consisted of, which is essentially classical logic, until I came upon logicism and the work of Bertrand Russell, Frege, Wittgenstein, Boole, and other relatively modern logicians. Here, logic is treated by people who also dealt with set theory, arithmetic, algebra, geometry, analysis, etc., and thus the form of the logical proposition which used to be expressed with, and as a consequence complicated by, language, was embodied in the form of the symbolic formula, which among other benefits, does away with the fetters of linguistic convention, leaving nothing unexamined. Symbolic logic involves construction, that is, showing or actually expressing the proposition through the arrangement of symbol systems and notations, and that is its chief advantage. This by no means says that symbolic logic is non-linguistic, in the colloquial sense of language, or that language, broadly speaking, is informal, in that logical sense of formality. But both are nested in the same expressive elan, to use the Bergsonian term. The difference is that symbolic logic is, let's say, more deliberate with respect to the principles of logic. It wants to express just that axiom or formality which, by the way, it perceives in language. It sees it, grasps it, then reformulates it in a way that can be manipulated and this is the chief purpose of formal logic, use it in areas outside the original domain of inquiry. The pinnacle of abstraction is reached in mathematics. If we inquire about what characterizes mathematics and what makes it so valuable, everyone would agree that it's just this function. It enables us to articulate concepts that are beyond the scope of ordinary language, such as ideas related to measurement, magnitude, and geometric relations. This is not to suggest that these concepts cannot be expressed using linguistic propositions. However, when we attempt to do so, the precision inherent in mathematics is rather substituted with generalizations. It is comparable to a specialist trying to explain a highly intricate concept to a non-expert audience. This dialectical relationship, where each faculty lacks the very thing that the other seems particularly suited to provide, is reminiscent of Heidegger's distinction between the ready at hand and the present at hand. Mathematics deals solely with the present at hand, according to him, leaving the ready at hand to the philosopher, whose attempts at rigor are hindered by the inherent generality of ordinary language. However, mathematicians face a similar challenge. The rigor aims for a generality, but they can only express it in the coded language of mathematics. Thus, both mathematicians and philosophers grapple with the limitations of their respective tools in capturing the full scope of their insights. The fact of the matter is, the success of the mathematician rides as much on the precision of his mathematical techniques and the consistency of his proofs as on their generalizability or expressibility in general terms. This goes back to the original point, reformulation, or, as we reformulated it in this context, generalizability, defined as the degree to which research findings can be applied to other situations. These two tendencies are synthesized in logic, as in, we can represent the linguistic in mathematics and, thanks to the project of logicism, the mathematical in language. It informs us that these two fields not only have a common link, but that this link is unbreakable. Can text be made as poetically expressive as language, yet as deductively clear and precise as a mathematical proposition?
This is the central question of the philosophy of language, and to a greater degree, of the theory of knowledge. In the Quran, we discover that the language itself embodies this concept. However, a reader who approaches the Quran as they would any other text will not perceive this, and they would likely acknowledge this themselves. Let's conduct a small experiment to illustrate this point. First, open the Quran to any chapter and verse, and keep the book open. Next, pick up another book from your shelf, possibly a beloved novel. Read one page from the novel, and then shift your focus to the Quran, reading a page from there as well. Now, if I were to ask you about the difference between the two texts, your most probable response would be that it lies in the subject matter they cover. This observation suggests that the distinction between the Quran and other texts is not immediately apparent, or rather, that the two texts can be read the same way. Perhaps you're of the analytical sort and have a sharper response that says that the difference lies in the literary structure, that the Quran is didactic, instructive, and legalistic, while your novel is more satirical, romantic, or visual. But the fact is, we're nowhere near what makes these two texts different. Comparing their literary style or content assumes they can be approached the same way. This approach is fundamentally flawed from the start.
You're suggesting that the problem with conventional approaches to reading the Quran is that they don't sufficiently take into account the reader's own capacity to understand and access the text itself, and that we rely too much on given interpretations.
Something like that. But there's more to it. In the philosophical tradition of Immanuel Kant, true understanding requires critical subjectivity, an active reflection on how our own mental faculties shape our interpretation. To adequately grasp the Quran's meaning, we must start by examining our own role and assumptions as readers, rather than treating the text as a passive object of analysis. Reflection is not straightforward either. It proceeds by rules. Rules that, when correctly followed, always leads to profound insights. But there's a problem here. We need to understand what those rules are, and the order of their operation, their relations to one another, and how to properly wield them, as the example of Joseph in chapter 12, verse 4, shows. Joseph's vision of the 11 constellations is a manifestation of the intrinsic harmony and arrangement that characterizes their existence. The word ahada, when combined with ashara, which signifies a group or class of entities sharing a common attribute, conveys a sense of unity and cohesion. This combination, forming the number 11, represents a structured arrangement where the individual elements are understood as belonging to a larger, interconnected whole. The reference to 11 constellations in this context is not merely a numerical count, but rather an expression of an underlying organizational principle, a mereological relationship that binds these celestial bodies together as parts of a harmonious cosmic system. But I digress.
In other words, we're not comporting to what the text seems to be saying, but are deliberating our approach. The Quranic word is not given in the sense that the actual meaning is that which the passage conveys to me as a person immersed in a tradition, but rather given in a different sense. It's given in that its meaning is potentially in the text at large. You may liken this approach to induction or falsification, but as the topic prioritizes the symbolic logical approach, we want something a little more technical than that. you'll find this straightforward as you already engage in this sort of reasoning that we're going to describe. The first major rule is tautology. In propositional logic, a tautology is a formula or proposition that is true in every possible interpretation. This is what your critical analysis commences with. But note that true here isn't something controvertible, something you may find agreeable or otherwise. It's what you must accept first before you could find it agreeable or disagreeable. It's the form of general existential validity. It is true insofar as you have a proposition at your grasp, something to deal with, something to judge.
Let's consider the statement, London is the capital of Austria. Based on your knowledge of geography, you will object to this claim and reply that it's false. This reaction is perfectly understandable. However, from the perspective of logic, specifically the rule of tautology, the statement would be considered true. The tautological truth here does not depend on the actual geographical facts about London or Austria. Instead, it relies on the mere existence of the proposition itself. Logic would argue that for you to even declare the statement false, you must first acknowledge it as a valid proposition. Were it not valid, it would not be comprehensible enough to be factual or otherwise. It simply would not exist. In other words, you have to recognize that the assertion, London is the capital of Austria, has been made, regardless of its factual accuracy. From a logical standpoint, the truth value here is not derived from the correspondence between the claim and reality, but rather from the presence of the proposition itself. The fact that someone has put forth this statement is sufficient for it to be considered logically true. So, while you are wrong in terms of geographical facts, logic would maintain that the statement is true based on the principle of tautology. It is the existence of the proposition, not its factual accuracy, that establishes its logical truth.
I infer from this that logical falsehood must be equivalent to logical truth, which would mean that the basis of falsehood here is not correspondence to what we think of as reality, i.e., that London is actually a city in England and Vienna is the capital of Austria. Reality for logic is the structure of a proposition. That there is a proposition is reality. This implies that if judged from the standpoint of correspondence, we're making a reference to some other proposition to which we attach the notion of logical validity a priori, and reject the so-called false proposition on the basis of its inconsistency with it. Or, let's say, both are claiming the same underlying thing, but one of them is false merely because it's different from the other.
Yes, it is, as you said, because logic deals with structure, and structure betrays traditional notions of truth and falsehood. Because structure is relative, and relativity has to do with the order of things in any given instance. An order varies, and at any given instance, what's the case may not be. And this relativity is needed to look at things from different perspectives. An analysis requires that both the order as it is and as it could be both valid. This is tautology, in a nutshell. That there is a proposition is reality, and that there could be such a proposition is reality also. This makes the false, in the traditional sense, a possible truth, an approximation, a deferred statement, or something that anticipates a truth. But as you saw, tautology represents the valid and the not yet valid, or what exists and what could exist, insofar as both simply are. And this is what the symbolic formula expresses, PVP, that the truth, P, and the falsehood, P, share the variable P as a common denominator.
But I see more in it. If tautology asserts the validity of what is and what could be, or let's say, the valid and the possible as you put it, does this not mean that there are two truths and two falsehoods? That what is false when what could be is asserted as valid, since it's asserted as opposed to it, and vice versa. It clearly shows that both have to be true and false at least once, even if they're originally held to be either true or false. This difference seems to bring out the meaning of what could be, because, as I see it, there's at least another possible state that a proposition may assume when held to be in a particular state. it always maintains the possibility to be in a different state than whatever state it's in. This seems to me a condition inherent within tautology.
Absolutely. What you're describing there is the rule of absorption. It is that rule by which we preserve the validity of some proposition when not immediately asserted. Absorption laws simplify logical formulas without changing their truth value. And by simplify I mean defer or withhold, ensuring equivalence, analogous to how a tautology is true under all circumstances. Suppose we are counting apples in a fruit stall. You are using the number system, natural numbers, to count 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Let's ask, where do the rest of the numbers go as we count each? When you count 3, where are the rest of the numbers? Certainly, they are somewhere. But where? The rest of the numbers, 4, 5, 6, are always present within the number system you're using, just not asserted, but they exist, and as such fall within range tautological validity. If you examine the formula, you will think initially that there is one truth and one falsehood, but then your acquaintance with tautology will have revealed to you another dimension that shows two truths, namely that P is true and that not P, the false P, is actually true. Because you learn that in order to say of not P that is false, it must be true that it's false. Thus the false must at some level be truly false. Absorption is the flipped side of this. There's a state in which P is not yet true, where it's possible or anticipated, but not yet explicitly noted as true. This is evident from the fact that we have a scheme at all. And since we do, we infer that this scheme was possible. This is the first sense of falsehood with which the fundamental state of bare validity is contrasted. These two are part and parcel of each other. Where there's anything, there was the possibility of its being, regardless of what it is, as this is the basic duality of the mind. But an important distinction to be made is between truth and falsehood as such, and the assertion that something is true and or false.
I noticed that there are indeed two orders, the existence of P and not P, or truth and falsehood, and the actual assertion that P is true and not P false. P and not P must exist for me to make the value assertions about them in the first place. So it appears we're making that same distinction that Peirce makes between the object and the sign, or Kant makes between the thing in itself and our interpretations of it. Both say that one must exist for the other to exist. The sign is always a sign of some object, and the interpretation always an interpretation of something.
Yes, the assertion that P is true and not P is false are assertions about P and not P. They are of a different order than the former, but which are necessary for its completion and for the notions of truth and falsehood to arise in the first place. This means that we have two orders of truth and two orders of falsehood, and what the rule of tautology states is the validity of assertions at all levels. Because, as a rule, since it has to do with the truth at large, even the falseness of some truth, it itself arises from the condition of falsehood, because what's asserted must be asserted at the expense of what's not asserted, which in this case is the possibility of said assertion.
You're suggesting that the proposition points to itself, a kind of self-reference, but is this not paradoxical? Didn't Russell establish a whole branch of logic to deal specifically with this problem?
It's not paradoxical actually, because the assertion about P or not P and P and not P are not equivalent. The former, the assertion, is a limiting case of the objects. This is why they must belong to different orders, which is precisely Russell's solution. The assertion about P is a limiting case of the object P, inasmuch as an instance of the number 2 is a limiting case of the universal number 2 that can exist in a different instance. This is known in propositional logic, which is why we have Q and not Q, in addition to P and not P. Q is the assertion of the truth of P, and not Q the assertion of the falsehood of not P.
I see something here. When you put it like that, what seems to rise are rules of inference, particularly modus tollens and modus ponens, as these rules seem to place P in conjunction with Q, in the case of modus ponens, and not Q in conjunction with not P in modus tollens. We can add to this that we maintain the possibility to refer directly and laterally to the truth of any of these propositions, a priori, not P, which would naturally create a disjunctive syllogism, insofar as I maintain the possibility, not P, to assert some instance of truth or falsehood, Q, since, as you said, Q is a limiting case of truth, and truth is merely what's actually asserted. Thus Q also applies to falsehood, if we hold that the assertion of possibility is a true assertion. But I can't say this without involving the hypothetical syllogism, which treats any possible truth, not Q, as an original truth, P. In other words, the object of any reference would be a reference already given within the system. But something happens to the definition of truth and falsehood when you posit two different orders of it, because the assertion of truth, Q, when applied to a lower order falsehood, not P, is what gives truth or validity to falsehood in the first place, i.e., a disjunctive syllogism, inasmuch as the assertion of falsehood, not Q, is what gives us the possibility of asserting truth in the first place, i.e., a hypothetical syllogism. Thus this order explains for us the relation between truth and falsehood and how each qualifies the other, allowing us to speak of the relation of truth to falsehood as a validation, and of falsehood to truth as potentiation or potentializing. To put it differently, truth becomes a validating principle when it occupies that position formerly assigned to falsehood, and likewise falsehood becomes a potentiating intuitional principle when it occupies that place formerly assigned to truth. To simplify it further, truth presupposes the possibility of this truth, inasmuch as the possibility, a possibility of truth.
To add to your point, I happen to notice that the rules of tautology and absorption emerge as necessary interpretive schema when we think of non-contradiction in terms of the four rules of inference. These four rules seem to coordinate the position of each component, and by extension, its relation to the other. In so doing, new rules seem to emerge as necessary conditions. As you put it, there's the assertion of truth and of falsehood, both captured by modus ponens and modus tollens. Then there's the positive assertion of falsehood and the negative assertion of truth, both of which captured by the disjunctive and hypothetical syllogisms. This pattern is the same one used in algebra and topology, even set theory and Venn diagrams. It even appears in the wave function of quantum mechanics.
This conjunction, this adjunction if you will, or mixing of what should be independent, is not only inevitable, but is the necessary next step, because here we make a direct and immediate reference to how we first came to define our terms, and this is what a higher order means in logic. It's that which explains how we arrive at the lower order. Applied to our case, this duality in application and in definition is where the binary system of zeros and ones come from, because it's given that the emergence of higher order operations corresponds to greater degrees of freedom as far as the manipulation of statements and the ways in which a statement can be interpreted. And as far as the conjunction of the two orders of truth and falsehood, of tautology and absorption is concerned, we obtain the law we call non-contradiction. This law is the foundation of all reasoning, a principle that has fueled remarkable advances in philosophy, mathematics, and computing. It forms the basis of the binary arithmetic system of zeros and ones, and in turn underlies the digital circuitry and logic gates that make modern computers possible. At its core, the law emerges from the interplay between higher and lower orders of truth and falsehood. It's a fundamental principle that reflects the human capacity for logical thought and problem solving. The binary nature of truth and falsehood, of opposites, is the embodiment of the law of non-contradiction. But again, we obtain this law only as the conjunction of the rules of tautology and absorption which explain the full extent of this law. Going past the bare statement of a proposition cannot be true and false simultaneously in the same context, and actually shows how this dynamic unfolds. It tells the story right from the start, so to speak, and explains how we can have the interchange of truth and falsehood in the same context by positing the structure of what is and what could be. What's a great example of this in everyday life?
A car, or any mechanical system, your body included, operates this way too. Pressing the gas pedal accelerates the car. It's here where the action is, the point of mechanical emphasis, the center of force. In a second, the emphasis will shift over to some other part of the vehicle. This is despite the fact that every part of the system is instrumental to the effect or output of any given part. This shifting of emphasis from and to different parts of the car according to the situation is logically non-contradictory because it involves a duality between some immediate function and the possibility of another within the one system. And in each case, all peripheral parts, the parts that are not emphasized, are absorbed, and this absorption is necessary for the maintenance of this change. In a mathematical context, we'd use a variable to denote the rest of the system as opposed to the true, given part. But notice that when we shift our focus over to the variable, the absorbed part, we also shift the truth value over to it in real time, absorbing in the process what used to be the true or real part. This is tautology and absorption functioning together.
I feel we've ventured too far into the domain of logic that we've forgotten the original topic. How does this relate to the Quran and our understanding of its terms? To start, how is this law of non-contradiction useful in this case?
The short answer is that the Quran is composed of words as the simplest units of meaning, and to understand a verse, a chapter, a narrative, one must understand the words. And to understand the words in their true sense and import, we must analyze it. There it is. The inevitability of analysis leads back to the problem of method. And as far as method's concerned, we could look no further than logic. If we actually apply the principle of non-contradiction to the analysis of a Quranic term, what first happens is that we relinquish or abdicate whatever meaning we suppose the word to have. Non-contradiction, when applied, has the effect of negating anything already in existence. Because since it's the simplest, most fundamental law, it doesn't add anything to anything. It is, in itself, the beginning of logical analysis, of thought, period. This difference is a good sign, as it means that we're in sync with these rules, that we're beginning to make the transition from the domain of convention to that of pure reason. There's an isomorphic relation between the mind of the thinker and the rules according to which the mind naturally experiences objects. And the result is that the object is arranged in precisely the manner in which it should. The term is stripped down to that state of general validity or truth. Think of it this way. There's no meaningful term as such here. There's what Cassira would call an analytic entity, a general object that we are able to analyze. The concept of validity is applicable here, insofar as we have a concept to which the rules of logic can be applied in the widest, broadest sense. We're essentially running a logical module in parallel to the word, whose meaning we are only vaguely acquainted with. The aim here is to have the logical module act as a course correction procedure as we proceed to analyze the term. Ard here, then, is understood in terms of its general validity and its possibility. Way of conceiving the term is actually the same as that which modern science first conceptualized the concept of energy.
The word ard recurs 461 times in the Quran, in various morphological and grammatical forms. These represent the boundary of the word, the limit within which it is understood as an individual concept. This defines the universe of discourse for the word, how we're going to understand it. This universe of discourse is essential, in that it's what decides how much factors into the overall meaning and sense of the word. The law of non-contradiction fits this whole domain within its binary structure, saying that, at the most fundamental level, there's only the assertion of the word and the possibility of asserting it.
Yes, it's precisely here. This new domain of analysis, where the rules of absorption and tautology, which make up the law of non-contradiction, will apply. We utilize this restriction to derive the meaning of our word. Absorption maintains for us every morphological or contextual discourse in the background as we transition from one modification to another. And tautology keeps these possible meanings, absorbed in the background, as valid in addition to any particular determination of meaning. Thus, if in one context the word ard expresses a domestic sense, like verse 22 of chapter 2, whereas the current verse, say 6, of chapter 78 that it appears in, expresses a different sense of the term. The domestic meaning is maintained as relevant to the new and accounted for, and it enters as a possible mediating or analytical factor into every new expression or rendition of the term. But the meaning of the word in each context isn't the important thing. It's that the word remains open to other interpretations and approaches. Thus, we must interpret this variance as to what the term could mean in different contexts as mainly a reflection of the dynamic of validity and possibility. Thus, tautology, jointly with absorption, gives us continuous access to immediate as well as possible terms and allows us to rotate around these two dynamic poles, restricting us to the word as such and the possible conditions of the word. Thus, we can say that the law of non-contradiction exclusively provides the structure of validity and possibility, any immediately given expression, say odd, and any possible, non-immediate, or derivable meaning of the word. Non-contradiction only provides this outline. The rules of tautology and absorption are what really operationalizes this law. It gives us this dynamic, to and fro movement from what's immediately the case and what's not immediate, but is relevant to the case. But all in all, positively restricts us to this dyad.
It's important to consider that non-contradiction only gives us the binary structure of true and false, valid and possible. It does not determine the elements of its own structure. The either-or function of determination is carried out by the law of excluded middle. This is an example of how we circumvent Russell's paradox using the same essential rules of logic. But non-contradiction isn't usually thought of in terms of the two orders of truth and falsehood, a crucial oversight that in turn affects how we understand the law of excluded middle. In the traditional sense, the principle only states that every proposition must be either true or false. There's no third option or middle ground. But this is incomplete. The reality is, we must show how it's possible to assert that something is either true or false. This is attained when we consider that there is a higher level from which these determinations are made. Hence, the law of excluded middle is fully represented through considerations of the ground of each determination.
This is indeed the case. In fact, I'm an advocate of the view that the law of excluded middle is either the same as or relies on universal quantification. The idea that a given statement or property applies to all elements within a specified domain of discourse. For all x, px is true. A universally quantified statement for all x p of x is true if px holds for every possible x in the domain. It is false if there exists at least one x in the domain for which px does not hold. This is a clearer exposition of the law of excluded middle, because to state either truth or false involves predication. And since there are two orders of truth and falsehood, it can only mean that we can have truth and falsehood as assertions, by having lower order truth or falsehood as the genus px and their assertions as limiting cases x. Thus, the universal quantifier captures, more accurately than the classical law of the excluded middle, the assertability of either truth or falsehood, by showing how each assertion has a basis in the self-same system. Moreover, universal quantification fully accounts for the absorptional and tautological rules operative within the same structure. Using a variable to maintain the relativity of assertions, the p in the formula denotes the generally valid at any given instance, and x as the placeholder for either truth or falsehood. But the scope of px is important. Quantifying truth, for example, involves all assertable functions and values of truth within the domain, and likewise of falsehood. This is what for all x means. We don't only assert truth from the standpoint of higher order truth, but we take into account the various possible expressions of truth which non-contradiction through absorption and tautology establish for us. This link is absolutely essential.
I can think of many examples of this rule in the quantifier sense in real life. What we conceive we ourselves produce, or in the Stoic maxim, we reap what we sow. Two objects perceived in space is, this law tells us, the result of implementing the concept of two-ness. That we decided to focus on a numerical aspect of the object results from an application of the concept of number to the object. and that we specifically see to results from a similar though more differentiated application, namely, a numerical concept. This bridges a gap which Kant and others have tried to close between representation and the faculty of representing. Truth and falsehood, this framework tells us, results purely from our capacity to apply them. But what we apply in the fullest sense, as you said. In a nutshell, that we recognize true arises from a higher order application of truth. That we recognize false arises from a higher order application of falsehood. Predication arises at precisely this level, and remains within the bounds of the system, hence predicate logic. More than anything, this shows that non-contradiction alone is not enough. It relies through and through upon the ability to determine the poles of non-contradiction, but the determinability of said poles involves their direct application. A new role is thus factored that accounts for this granular aspect, and this is the law of excluded middle. But just as non-contradiction is specified by the two rules of tautology and absorption, so is the law of excluded middle. For the latter, we have the rules of contraposition and exportation. How would you explain these?
Think of the function of an instance of legal violation or infringement, and how it ties to or implicates the whole legal system. We say it breaks the law, or it's punishable by X penalty. There's what seems to be in seamless and implicational transition from the instance to the precedence, an immediate incitement, as it were, which says that this instance of infringement or enforcement is representative of the system at large, the system at large being the precedent. Now, the context is not important. You can substitute it for any other. You can talk about any whole from the standpoint of any instances of that whole. It's what gives us Px as the premise of X, or allows us to infer the general from the instance. But inference in the sense that I'm always and continuously able to infer the precedent given the instance. So it's not an immediate inference so much as the possibility of inference as a power or capacity within the analysis. In a word, predicability. This is contraposition.
Contraposition does not appear to tell us from which standpoint a totality may be viewed, but almost as a matter of course, seems to leave this undecided. You see this rule when you say all languages of the world. We're applying contraposition to the concept language, but the standpoint is not a particular language, but any language, and any is a variable that captures a higher order falsehood, not Q. We call not Q higher order falsehood because by contrast to lower order falsehood, or falsehood as such, it is predicable of some term, making it a hypothetic syllogism. Lower order falsehood precedes a priori. It does not reveal anything. It is the state that precedes any determination period. Precedes it in the same sense in which Deleuze holds difference to precede identity. The same goes for lower order truth. It is the already valid, not the predicable sense of validity, but the condition of any, and of contraposition specifically, is not that which we see in mereology, of yellow, for example, being the instance of the genus color, or silver being an instance of metal. When you perceive the system at large, your holistic disposition sets up that condition which allows you to view the whole through whatever quality or property the part possesses. You can choose, for example, to study the whole substance metal from the standpoint of density or elasticity, and actually choose to glean in other aspects of metal properties which you may call elastic or dense. You're never restricted to any part. What's important here is knowing that contraposition is simply the program that makes this possible, because it uses a variable, any, as its standpoint, not a definite part. Thus we have ard, on one hand, and every possible modification and expression of it. Our analysis of the word does not exit the circle, and cannot determine anything outside it. Should it do so, like citing a dictionary, then, despite pertaining to the word ard, and could be considered as falling under the rubric of possible meanings of ard, i.e. false, it would violate this law because it contains a judgment or judgments inconsistent with the structural sense which the logical scheme is building up. Again, the logic is concerned only with how we arrange and condition our relation to the word, before any meaning a dictionary could give us.
Let's put it this way. What we mean by every possible modification are not modifications to the meaning of the word "ard," but modifications to the ways in which the word embodies any given rule of logic. Let me explain. If we understand the word "ard" in terms of the rule of absorption, then this would count as a meaning, or a truth value, if you will. If we understand it in terms of the rule of exportation, then this too would be another meaning. If we understand it in terms of the rule of tautology, then this would be yet another meaning. Some may object, saying that these are only structural aspects of the interpretation of the word, whose sole purpose is to give us meaning rather than be objectively meaningful themselves. But this would be the same objection which many had leveled at Einstein's theories of special and general relativity. For this is precisely the methodological principle through which Einstein arrived at his revolutionary theories. For what relativity is, in principle, is only an epistemological structure, an assessment of the various standpoints from which an object can be intellectually approached. Every perspective yields a different view and interpretation of the object, and this is, according to it, as according to the rules of contraposition and exportation, by the way, the precise definition of objectivity.
The law of excluded middle is essential in this respect. It says that we can only determine either of the structural conditions of non-contradiction. But since truth and falsehood become diversified into different structural expressions and conditions of truth and falsehood, as necessary implications of the existence of two orders of truth and falsehood, and of the mediating role of the rules of replacement, the differentiation of the function of exclusion into contrapositive and exportive relations is revealed as necessary. This shows that diversity does not arise from duality, as many different arrangements and orders of duality, but more profoundly, it does away with the chimerical repercussions by introducing laws which govern diversity as though it were a single entity or scheme.
Contraposition affirmingly states the valid impossibility. It thus uses a higher order falsehood, the truly false, to state a lower order falsehood, thereby pointing to all that which can appear or manifest as true. Every valid proposition falls within the range of contrapositive judgment. Through contraposition we attain a permanent posture towards the valid. But the non-contradictory roots of this rule is further emphasized by its relation to exportation. To be clear, you never perform or produce a contrapositive judgment using contraposition alone. But you can only do this by another rule, a rule that allows you to mediate between the whole and the undefined possible instance. This is exportation. This rule says that we never determine anything unless through another thing. For example, you're going to work. Exportation, in the broadest sense, will focus on something like the relation of going to the object work. There's a mediation here, work. The objective is mediated or indicated by a relation of going. It focuses on the expedient relation between the objective and something that determines the objective. Exportation allows us to understand and expedite the units, going, to, and any other units of meaning that relates to whatever the objective of the phrase is, work. You'd be correct in suggesting that this is a quantificational process, for this is the existential quantifier. It's what determines the continuous and independent validity of the variable x, which is consummated by the universal quantifier in the expression p of x. It's what actually and discretely extends the scope of px, the premise, through continuous and successive determinations of it.
So, from a certain perspective, exportation is how we determine anything in the first place, because our knowledge is always discursive. It uses means to reach an end, but at the same time, contraposition is how we have objectivity in the first place. It gives both the object and all possible means of determining it at the same time, insofar as the object is, in the widest sense, true or false. Thus it involves the same mode specified in universal quantification, except it applies it as the continued possibility of inference to the non-contradictory conditions of analysis, and x looking back at a px, not from the standpoint of quantification, of the positivity of truth or falsehood. To be more precise, for contraposition, the whole structure is our objective. But to the universal quantifier, or the law of excluded middle, it's the positivity of the elements, the structure, in relation to the structure at large. You can say that contraposition is cosmological, but universal quantification is genealogical. Thus, on analyzing the law of excluded middle, you will find that it's primarily defined by the rules of contraposition and exportation. In analyzing logical rules, you come to see a strange pattern. The rules are so intertwined that what explains a rule is always another rule, and what explains that other rule is always a rule other than itself. The structure is quite recursive and regressive, meaning that a logical rule contains within itself the whole system of rules. There is no assertion without its conditions. But how can the word or expression imply or presuppose the whole structure? We have here the law of identity, defined as A equals A. What is the same as something is that thing itself. This law is usually taken to refer to external identities. But what it really points to, the identical that is that which different things have in common. We noted this in two instances. To say P is true and not P is false are values of the same underlying reality, the context that relates them to each other. As Samuel Alexander put it, two things are alike only if they are different, and different if they are identical. Thus, an identical proposition never pertains to the elements of the proposition, but to the underlying context, that which they have in common, the ground on which they stand, and on which their union depends. If we ask what it is that can be said to be the case with anything whatsoever, we find that it's the fact that they can be held to be true or false, i.e. their logical value, that they fall within the logical structure of possibility and validity. Here we express identity in our orientation of the basis of some concept or term. By approximation, what in quantum mechanics is called superposition is really what the law of identity states, and is really the best expression of this principle. Because identity is not something we arrive at, but a condition from which we begin. It's something we already assume in things we interact with at any level. And the most precise and true of those levels is the level that represents this assumption as a precondition, because in this sense, it would be acknowledging its place in the order of mental acts. Thus, identity is the underlying structure, the systematic basis of something, the most inclusive thing that can be said about it. Or it can be thought of this way, that identity is the minimal requirement or critical mass for a relation with something, the sine qua non of some process. You can see that this is always the case, whatever the case may be. Judgment may say that it's a tree, a door, skyline, but the condition which logic prescribes survives in each case, making the judgment expedient. The fact that identity rests upon non-contradictory grounds means that the word can assume any form or shape whatsoever, but remain essentially tied to that scheme, in which it's the continued object of analysis. Thus, given a proposition P, identity asserts the context. This can range from the specific scheme in which P appears. For example, the exportation formula, P implies Q in conjunction with R, or it can point to the system of propositional calculus, that is the ground of P. These are relative explications of what constitutes identity from a logical standpoint. Or P could be the ground itself, but only relative to something else, of which P could be said to be the ground. Now, identity, just like the law of excluded middle and non-contradiction, is composed of rules of replacement. We find here the rules of commutativity, used heavily in algebra, which states P in conjunction with Q equals Q in conjunction with P. The order of the operands does not affect the results of the operation. And material implication, which refers to the relationship between two propositions where one proposition implies the other. Why is this? And how are these two rules linked?
This is shown in the symbolic expression. The conjunction of any two terms, P and Q in particular, already relies on implication as a means of explaining the terms related. For P to be related to Q is something given prior and independent from the fact that we can explain the content of relation, in this case. But logic emphasizes the important role of explanation through the use of material implication. That there's a relation between two things easily means that one is related to the other, and the other is related to the one. This explanation automatically gives us the rule of commutativity, but it gives it as a vehicle of explaining the relation of implication between the terms. In relation to the law of identity as we've defined it, we can see how one instance of implication reveals requisite orders of the terms related, and how inversely the order itself reveals the particular relation of the terms to one another. We see here how in one stroke, these two rules relate to each other. At every level of analysis, the same structure conditions arise, the same schematic structure is reintroduced, and the order of rules remain applicable at every rendition and instance of the term.
We thus see how identity relates to the conventional sense of that word. Only we see the necessary form of it. And this necessary form shows what Kant means when he says that the conditions of the possibility of experience in general are likewise the conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience. For commutativity here gives us the conditions of the possibility of some relation, of which implication is the demonstration. The commutative relation grounds the implication, and implication arises from the commutative order as its interpretation. A closer look will show you how identity relies on the other rules. It relies, for instance, on absorption, for the introduction of the same conditions requires that these conditions be absorbed, somewhere in the background as it were. And it relies on tautology in order that the conditions be valid, whether stated or simply held possible. But identity is not expository as such. It does not explain what goes into the claim. It only grounds or bases some claim. It says that there is no instance that is baseless. Whitehead uses the expression occasions to approximate this relation, and why he holds them to be the ultimate building blocks of reality, reality being what grounds them, and that which they are occasions of. And an occasion of this sort is only considered occasional because there's a ground for it. Thus Whitehead would add to occasion the expression concrescence, and together these phenomena explain what he calls actual occasions. Think of how each drop of saliva contains the genetic/biochemical information that reflects the entire biological lineage of some species. Each single act of logical inference necessarily embeds or instantiates the entire system of logical rules that make the inference possible. The same thing that brings us the occasions is what is occasioned. Thus, when analyzing a Quranic term, this rule maintains that the term is based or grounded in the system of logic in which it's held as an analytic entity, but also that it's based or grounded in the Quran as the system in which the word is found. This shows that identity has a subjective pole, the system of logic employed by the analyst, and an objective pole, the environment or domain in which the term naturally occurs. But there's a relativistic side to what may ground some occasion of a term, and this is decided by the context and the factors that are in play. Quran-wise, this may be a chapter in which the word occurs, or a topic that spans a number of chapters, or the whole Quran. If we're talking the system of logic that we're applying, then we may start by seeing what rules happen to be occasioned, say tautology, then infer non-contradiction as the relative ground. If contraposition, then we may infer the law of excluded middle as the ground. If modus ponens, then the rules of inference as the ground, and so on. There is a relative ground for any relative occasion, and that ground is usually some set or class to which it immediately and most proximately relates. But suffices to know that the law of identity is embodied in this capacity to continually refer to this ground, whatever it may be, and in the characteristically commutative and implicational structure in which the occasion relates to its ground. Thus, as universal quantification confirms, the same objective relation that reveals for us the identity of some term are the same as those which we apply to identify the term.
Identity is essential because it emphasizes the systematic basis of any occasion. As from it, we can deduce the specific import of any rule. We can regress to any other logical function by a definite, consistent sequence, or from a mere conjunction. We can derive or obtain, for example, the rule of distributivity, that, insofar as a conjunction necessitates at least two terms, distributivity makes this possible by formally distributing the terms to both sides of the equation which conjunction mediates. Or, if we so choose, we can derive from distributivity the rule of associativity by adding a predicate or subject to the distribution. Thus, we can place as the right argument of an algebraic equation the number 4 and the left argument, the number 5, and infer that this distribution of terms was conducted by way of their sum, the number 9, and 9 being that number through which this association of numbers is made possible. We have here derived an associative rule from a distributive function and showed that these two rules are related a priori. We can do this with any rule of logic and demonstrate the regression by a definite chain of deductions.
But what we're demonstrating here does not seem to be the law of identity, but a rule that's not often counted among the three fundamental laws of thought, as formulated by Boole, but a rule without which we cannot even begin to think about them. In using any rule of logic, we always, as the law of identity informs, rely and fall back on other rules of logic. This means that a rule is only a certain way of grouping the others, and that each rule varies in the manner of these configurations, which calls to mind the rule of contraposition and exportation, by the way. For here is shown how a system is expressed from the standpoint of one of its instances. Now, the system's self-relating or self-explaining capacity is what we're here concerned with. This is what's termed the principle of sufficient reason. Think of how the number 6 can be obtained using the 4 basic operations of arithmetic. There's 3 plus 3, 1 plus 2 plus 3, 2 plus 4, 10 minus 4, 8 minus 2. The possibilities are infinite, but despite this infinity, every case is a completely provable and deductively precise way of obtaining 6. You can see that each operation is a sufficient way of obtaining 6, sufficient in that it involves a deductive chain of operations whose basis is a self-same system of numbers. This systematicity or systematic unity is precisely what makes the deduction and the location or triangulation of 6 possible. But see that this application proves more than anything the systematicity of the field of application, the unity of the terms under one coherent framework. In logic, this is expressed using negation. This isn't immediately obvious from something like not P or not Q, as it requires a systematic grasp of these functions and how they relate to one another. We need to know how falsehood qualifies truth and truth falsehood, how deduction is possible given a set of correlated terms. We negate P or any other variable only as a reference to some underlying explanatory context. I negate so as to defer an explanation or proof. I do not know how this value is obtained, so I negate it to say that there is an explanation for it. An explanation whose precise details I do not possess or cannot provide for some reason. Leibniz, to whom the principle is attributed, phrases it this way.
Okay, how do I put it? When I think about a chiliagon, that is, a polygon with 1,000 equal sides, I don't always think about the nature of a side or of equality or of thousand-foldedness. In place of such thoughts, in my mind I use the words side, equal, and thousand. This kind of thinking is found in algebra, in arithmetic, and indeed almost everywhere. I call it blind or symbolic thinking. When a notion is very complex, we can't bear in mind all of its component notions at the same time. And this forces us into symbolic thinking. When we can keep them all in mind at once, we have knowledge of the kind I call intuitive. You're welcome.
Put it this way, that without the principle of sufficient reason, no deduction is possible. Without identity, no definitions are possible. Without the principle of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle, no scheme on the basis of which something could be defined or inferred is possible, is an example of the schematic application of the principle of sufficient reason, in showing the intimacy of the relations among the rules of logic and their objects. For the principle of sufficient reason is what allows you to glean this interdependence in the first place, and you use it in determining how one thing depends upon another, in determining contingencies, consequences, implications, presuppositions, because in each of these cases, you are actually explaining some system through certain contextual links. You find some unifying principle, here identity, as a criterion through which to understand how a thing relates to another schematically. This is because what the principle of sufficient reason explains, primarily, is in the content of judgment. Leibniz's Chiligon, or Alexander's ball, or Heisenberg's dice. But how the laws of identity, of excluded middle, and non-contradiction specifically cohere, and improving the reconstructability of the rules out of each other, and their relatability and contingency. The principle of sufficient reason renders this a faculty applicable to external systems, since the modularity of these external systems will be based on the modularity of these core logical functions. But the principle of sufficient reason isn't unlike the other three laws in being composed of other rules of replacement. This is why we count it among the laws of thought. Here we find the rules of transposition and associativity. Looking at the formalisms of these rules, they seem to resemble those of contraposition and exportation. Why is that?
There's a good reason for this. Associativity resembles exportation in a certain respect. Exportation relates signs or modes to some general object. It allows us to think of something through something else. Like, you can think of the past only in the present, or the whole only through some part. These are exportation statements. But the object in the logical sense is never as concrete as the instant by which we refer to it, but a possible object. An object in the inductive sense, an index, something that could only be approximated but never really attained. In associativity, the scheme is reversed. You think, instead of how you can wield some concept and give examples or cases of it. Thus the part becomes a predicate or example of the concept which in exportation appears as the objective. It denotes the principle or a rule by means of which a certain scheme is possible. In enumeration or thinking of relations between red, yellow and orange, associativity would denote the concept color as their associative or organizing principle, even when mixing two things that don't seem to belong to one another. The associative or organizing principle is their possible sum insofar as it's possible to relate the two objects in the first place. This is why a conjunction is used in place of implication in the associative formula. For, as we noted in relation to the law of identity, conjunction expresses a formal relation as opposed to implication, which explains how one term is related to the other. The difference in the use of these operators reflects the difference between these two rules. We use a material implication to express mediation and how terms relate to each other, and a conjunction to express priorness, how the terms are already necessarily related to each other. And just as exportation shows how we come to choose our terms, so does associativity indicate the concept in terms of which a certain relation is formed, or that the related is already nested in some concept. The selective nature of each determination is clearly present in both cases. The same relation is found between transposition and contraposition. Despite being symbolically identical, there's a crucial difference.
I see. Just as contraposition relates to continued possibility of inference, or generalizations, so does transposition allow for the possibility, from the standpoint of the same system, to specify, to introduce and instantiate, namely, the same instance from which contraposition makes its generalizations. The two are functionally the same, but opposite in their tendencies. The continued possibility of inference and the continued possibility of reference are consistent with the rules with which we find them already associated. The continued possibility of reference, transposition, is consistent with the associative rule in the sense that both embody rules or principles in relation to which objects or data are examples. Just as in contraposition, we have a panoramic depiction of the whole from the standpoint of a variable, undefined general instance. In transposition, the whole is our premise and the instance our objective, whereas in contraposition, the instance is our premise and the whole our objective. They explain the same scheme from two different directions. Thus, transposition becomes the general condition and domain of associative relations, and contraposition the general condition and domain of exported relations.
We can break this relation down even further and think of transposition as an implicational absorption. Think of the whole of these rules of logic, and specifically of the fact that you possess all the laws so as to apply them freely whenever the occasion to use any of them arises. This would be absorption, but not absorption by itself. Rather, there's the expectation of the immediate deployment of any rule caused by the addition of implication. This anticipation is another way of thinking of the principle of PSR. A mechanic has all the required tools in the shed by which to build or fix some device. The tools subsist in this scheme in a very specific sense. They are not really immediately applied, but they're also not non-existent. They're rather halfway between these states, not immediately applied, but not entirely dispensed with.
Transposition reveals a deep symmetry in logical relations. It shows that when two things are necessarily connected, this connection works both forward and backwards. It is not just a rule about switching terms around. It demonstrates how logical necessity contains within itself its own reverse image. It denotes a homeomorphic relation between the elements of a proposition P and Q, which can be extended to their negations. Homeomorphism is a one-to-one mapping between two topological spaces that is continuous in both directions. But these two elements are simply the higher order truth or falsehood and their lower order image. This last point is important. For example, in a relation between 4 and 5 in the equation 4 plus 5, transposition isn't the openness of 4 to 5 and backwards so much as the openness of their sum, the very condition on which the possibility of this equation holds to each of them. Here you can speak of a translatory process between the sum and each derivative of the sum, and each combination of these derivatives. The interrelation between aspects of one thing stems from the openness and continuous relatability of the elements to one another, a condition made possible by that in which these relations and the elements related naturally occur, or fall under. For example, the chemical mixing of two compounds does not only result in a new compound that combines them both, but in the combining of the minute elements that make each of them up. Thus, to combine the two is to combine all their composite elements. It's this relatability and synthesis among the smaller composites that make the new larger synthetic compound possible. This is what transposition denotes. This is different from associativity, but remains essential to it and inexpressible without it. Transposition requires an organizing constructive principle to provide the essential mechanism of relation and relatability. Associativity likewise requires a transformative deconstructive principle by which to express and demonstrate the associative processes. Transposition in relation to associativity gives us a much clearer picture of how the principle of sufficient reason works. Rather, a clearer sense of the schematism of this principle. We're here breaking the law down to what you may call provable chunks in the spirit of the same law, so that, if asked to demonstrate or show how the principle of sufficient reason works, we can directly think of it in terms of the conjunction of the rules of transposition and associativity. Viewed through the lens of this principle, the analysis of a Quranic term becomes a matter of how we can understand it by relating it to different rules of logic, by building a schema that explains how the word behaves when subject to different rules of logic. To move from the word's general relation to the system of logic, identity, to how it's articulated in a non-contradictory scheme, to how its states are determined within the scheme, to how these schematic states relate to any of the laws, and how the laws relate to any given state, to how the 8 rules of replacement contained within these 4 laws relate to each other within the framework of the analysis of the term. We'll see that the word can be analyzed at progressively deeper levels in parallel to the combinatorial possibilities of the rules.